we have not yet received from the Pentagon the costs of the war. Do you have either A, a cost estimate coming to us anytime soon, or B, a specific supplemental request?
So approximately at this day, we're spending about $25 billion on Operation Epic Fury. Most of that is munitions. There's part of that is obviously O&M and equipment replacement. We will formulate a supplemental through the White House that will come to Congress once we have a full assessment of the cost of the conflict.
Sure. So you're saying the full cost at this point is $25 billion?
Yeah, that's our estimate for the cost.
Okay. Interesting, because I'm glad you answered that question, because we've been asking for a hell of a long time, and no one's given us the number.
I want to go to Zachary Cohen to just get your thoughts on what we've heard so far.
Yeah, well, the big thing I think we've heard so far is $25 billion. That's how much the war with Iran has cost so far. And really, there's a concern among lawmakers that you talk to both privately and what we've heard publicly that there's really no clear off-ramp, no end to the war in sight at this moment. Strategically, ending the war and essentially declaring victory, is we've seen some reports that Donald Trump is just considering doing, would almost be a strategic catastrophe in some ways, critics would say. But the other thing that we're hearing too is, we just heard Congressman Courtney alluding to this, is that trying to understand how does the war with Iran compute with the national defense strategy, which really did highlight the threat from China. And it talked about positioning U.S. military assets and prioritizing assets in a way that countered that threat first and foremost. I think you mentioned that the strategy lists Iran as the fourth biggest threat to the U.S. homeland, and was wondering why then does the U.S. Navy have 3 aircraft carriers parked in the Middle East and only 1 in the general Indo-Pacific region. So that's going to be a question and a theme of this hearing as it goes on. How does the war with Iran make sense in the context of what the Pentagon has said is its actual strategy, which is countering China?
All right, I want to go to General Wesley Clark to get your take, General, on what we've heard so far and this $25 billion number for what the war has cost to this point. Help us understand that. Put that in perspective for us, if you could.
It's a substantial amount of money, but the money's less important than the actual assets that have been expended. And so we've lost radars from attacks. They're hard to replace. We're down to about 50% of our Tomahawk land attack missile inventory. We've shot up maybe a third of our ballistic missile intercept capacity and maybe half of the very high altitude THAAD missile inventory. These inventories on these missiles take, in some cases, several years to replace. And in addition, the ships that are out there that have them have to be replenished. And that's an operation in itself. So the money is important, yes, but it's less important than the actual production behind it, Pamela.
What is your concern, Sabrina, about the loss of munitions and weapons, as the general just pointed out?
I think what General Clark and also what Zach is pointing out is something that you're going to see Democrats push more on. You have 3 carrier strike groups operating in the Middle East. We've drawn down on major stockpiles that we could need in case we have to go to a war, potentially with China. You've also seen Marines been pulled out of the Indo-Pacific. You've seen our Patriot and THAAD batteries pulled out. So the Indo-Pacific right now is looking a bit bare. And so I think what you're going to see more Democrats push on is, if China is the priority for this administration and our challenge, our threat that we are facing, what are the assets and how are we going to rebuild our asset and our capacity over there in the Indo-Pacific? I also think what you're going to see more Democrats push on, and some of the lawmakers that I've been talking to that we're getting ready for this hearing, is the gas price issue. Constituents here at home are facing this everyday cost. What is the plan to open the strait, and how does this war end? I think after the vote series happens, you're going to see more Democrats push Pete Hegseth and General Kaine on. So what's the end goal? When are my constituents going to see lower prices at the gas pump? And I think, frankly, the answer is not for a very long time.
All right, I'm going to bring Beth Sanner in because, Beth, we are now beyond the 60-day mark of the Iran war. This is the first time that Pete Hegseth and Dan Kaine are going before Congress. This is the House Armed Services Committee to testify and answer questions from lawmakers. Explain to us why that timeline is so important.
Well, because we don't see the end of that timeline, right? I mean, yes, we're at 60 days. It's certainly longer than was the initial 4 to 6 week time frame, Pete Hegseth pushed back on this and said, look, compared to the forever wars that we were in and did nothing, this is nothing compared to that. But, I think that that's probably the wrong framing for America, but also for the rest of the world, which is suffering a lot more than we are. And I want to add a little bit to what Sabrina and Zach and General Clark said in terms of the implications of this, because some of this is just kind of intangible. But when Chairman or Ranking Member Smith was talking about the implications on allies and the criticism, it is that plus the fact that we don't have the presence in these theaters, that we will not have munitions to deliver, and real questions about whether we will be there if they are attacked, this Article 5 kind of idea. So it is much more significant and strategic.
And Zach, just help us better understand, and Sabrina, you too, if you want to jump in, the military assets that have been redeployed from near China to the Iran war, because obviously this is going to be a big focus.
Well, yeah, I think first off, looking at the Gerald Ford and looking how long that aircraft carrier has been deployed, I think over almost a year now. It's been first in Venezuela, and those initial strikes that Donald Trump was considering when he was telling the protesters that help was on the way. In part, he was unable to launch the sort of military strikes at that time against Iran because he didn't have the USS Gerald Ford in position to do so. And so we are looking still at this sort of mismatching of military assets, trying to move things into position on sort of an ad hoc basis. And that's sort of what I hear from my sources, that the decision-making process has really been ad hoc and on the fly, whereas typically the military is planning these things out in well in advance and knows exactly where its assets will be at a given time.
And to Zach's point, the Ford continues to be extended, which puts an incredible strain on our sailors and Marines out there. And I mean, these are people that have been away from their families, but not just that, it's also on the shipyards that schedule years out in advance to maintain these types of carriers. And so you're delaying timelines, setting everything back. That impacts the entire force. It puts a stress on the readiness. And that's why you're seeing members continuing to push on what does this mean for China? Because if that is our real threat, we have to redirect assets, and everything is delayed in terms of the timelines.
And as Beth and General Clark were both saying, the munitions issue is almost happening in parallel with the issue with our ships being overextended, our aircraft being flown at a higher rate than they need to be. The munitions stockpile is, according to our reporting and others reporting, is really been impacted by this war with Iran. That there are munitions like the Tomahawk missile that it could take 1 to 6 years to replenish and build up back to pre-war status. And so those are standoff weapons that military experts have been pretty much a consensus on, that you would need a large number of those and burn through a large number of those in a potential conflict with China. And so
hence the big price tag of what they're asking, $1.5 trillion in defense funding to replenish in part some of those munitions. I want to bring in Karim Sadjadpour just to bring us into what's going on in Iran right now. How are the Iranians looking at all of this?
Well, internally in Iran, Pamela, I think there's a debate about how they should be dealing with President Trump and the administration. One side of the debate says essentially Iran is under enormous economic duress. It can't win a military war against America and Israel, and therefore it's time to think about doing a deal. The other side of that debate in Tehran are the people we call hardliners, those who believe that resisting America is part of the regime's identity. And up until now, Tehran has prevailed in that it's survived and it's controlling the Strait of Hormuz. And so I think that debate hasn't yet, there isn't a clear winner of that debate. And that's why you see the statements from President Trump and others that Iran is too divided to come to the table.
All right, General Clark, to bring you back in, the Trump administration has been very vocal in criticizing U.S. allies like NATO for not doing more to aid the U.S. military operation in the region. What are you listening for today when it comes to the U.S. relationship with NATO?
Well, I hope the visit from King Charles III will change the U.S. tone with respect to Europe and our European allies. The fact is that all of our allies are democracies. You can't launch an operation in secret that nobody's ever heard about and then expect them to jump on board. They have to go to their parliaments. They have to look at public opinion. And when we've needed NATO and we go through the process, they're there. And if we continue to go through this process, they will be there for us. They know that this is in their interest, and the Brits are coming along, the French are coming along, and yes, there's criticism. Allies are democracies. It's what Winston Churchill said. The problem with allies is they each have their own opinions. And so that's the truth about NATO. But we need those allies. We need them militarily. We need their ships, their mine clears. We need them diplomatically. And of course, they're economically integral to the United States, as the King pointed out in his speeches yesterday. So it is important we deal with NATO through the NATO process. We know how to do that. We've done that before, but you can't do it simply by a surprise operation and a couple of tweets and expect them to jump in line. They're not U.S. states. They're their own sovereign countries.